Revenge motivation. Someone cuts you off in traffic. Your boss takes credit for your work. A friend betrays your trust. In that moment, something immediate rises up. Not sadness, not confusion. The urge to strike back. That urge has a name: revenge motivation. It's the drive to retaliate when you've been wronged, to answer harm with harm. And it doesn't show up because you're petty. It shows up because your brain registers injustice as a threat. A threat to your standing, your safety, your sense of fairness in the world. Here's how it works. When someone harms you, especially in a way that feels deliberate, it creates a debt. They took something from you. Respect, security, dignity. Revenge motivation is the impulse to collect. It promises restoration. It tells you that if you hit back, the world will make sense again. But here's the problem. Revenge doesn't just want fairness. It wants superiority. The goal shifts from evening the score to winning. You don't just want them to understand what they did. You want them to regret it. You want them smaller than you felt when they hurt you. This plays out everywhere. At work, it's the colleague who quietly sabotages the person who embarrassed them in a meeting. In relationships, it's the partner who withholds affection after a fight, not to protect themselves but to punish. In friendships, it's the slow freeze out after a perceived slight, the refusal to forgive until they've suffered enough. And the justification feels airtight. They started it. They deserve it. It's only fair. Revenge motivation wraps itself in the language of justice. But what it's really chasing is power. The feeling of power you lost the moment you were hurt. The problem is that the relief never lasts. You get your revenge, and for a moment it feels satisfying. But then the debt reappears, because revenge doesn't close the loop. It just starts a new one. Resentment. You remember the moment perfectly. What they said, how they looked, the exact feeling when it landed. It was months ago, maybe years, but it plays back like it happened yesterday. And every time it does, the anger sharpens. This isn't just memory, it's resentment. The emotional residue of harm that refuses to fade. Where revenge motivation is the immediate urge to strike back, resentment is what happens when you don't, when you can't. When the injury sits inside you, replaying on a loop. It works like this. Something unfair happens. An insult, a betrayal, a punishment you didn't deserve. At the time, you might swallow it. Stay quiet. Move on. But the brain doesn't let go that easily. It holds the injury in place, reviews it, reinforces it, turns a single event into a permanent scar. What makes resentment so corrosive is that it doesn't need new fuel. The original wound keeps reopening itself. You see the person who hurt you, and the feeling floods back. You hear their name and your chest tightens. They've moved on. You haven't, and the gap between their indifference and your ongoing pain makes the resentment grow. It shows up in relationships as the thing you can't forgive but won't confront. The partner who dismissed your feelings once, and now every disagreement carries the weight of that first slight. The friend who flaked on you when it mattered, and now you keep score of every minor inconvenience they cause. The parent whose criticism decades ago still shapes how you hear feedback today. And the cruelest part is that resentment convinces you it's protecting you. It tells you that if you let go, you're letting them win. That holding on to the anger is the only way to preserve your dignity. So you carry it. Month after month. Year after year. A weight that started as a wound and turned into something closer to identity. The person who hurt you has gone on with their life. But you're still locked in that moment, waiting for a resolution that will never come. Because resentment doesn't resolve. It just grows heavier. Spite. Your sister gets the promotion. Your neighbor buys the nicer car. Your ex moves on first. And instead of moving forward, you make a choice. A choice that doesn't help you. a choice that might even hurt you. But it guarantees they won't get what they want either. You block them on everything, cutting off any chance of closure. You turn down opportunities just to avoid crossing paths. You refuse help when you need it because accepting would mean they were right. The goal isn't to win. The goal is to make sure they lose. This is spite. Revenge stripped down to its most irrational form. It's the willingness to burn your own hand just to watch them flinch from the heat. Where revenge motivation seeks restoration and resentment feeds on replaying the wound, spite operates on a simpler principle: if I can't have it, neither can you. The mechanism runs deeper than logic. When someone gets something you wanted, or moves past you in a way that highlights your stagnation, it triggers a specific kind of pain. Not just loss, but comparative loss. They didn't just succeed. They succeeded while you didn't. And that gap becomes unbearable. So spite steps in with a solution. Deny them satisfaction. Deny them peace. Deny them the clean ending they're hoping for. It doesn't matter if you suffer in the process. What matters is that they don't get to walk away unscathed. You see it in divorce proceedings that drag on for years, neither side willing to compromise because compromise feels like defeat. In family feuds where inheritance is refused out of principle, even when the money is desperately needed. In friendships that end not with a clean break, but with deliberate sabotage, each person ensuring the other regrets ever knowing them. And spite always justifies itself the same way. They don't deserve your kindness. They don't deserve your cooperation. If you give them what they want, you're letting them win. So you withhold. You obstruct. You make everything harder than it needs to be, not because it benefits you, but because it costs them. The tragedy is that spite never feels irrational while you're in it. It feels like dignity. It feels like self-respect. It feels like the only way to maintain control when everything else has been taken from you. But what it actually does is trap you in a losing game. One where the only victory is making sure no one wins at all. Retaliatory aggression. They insult you in front of others. Not a subtle jab. A direct attack. And before you can think, you're already moving. Back. Shoving. Throwing something. The reaction is instant, unfiltered, bypassing every rational filter your brain supposedly has. This isn't calculated revenge. It's retaliatory aggression. The immediate, explosive response to perceived threat or disrespect. Where revenge motivation builds toward a goal and resentment simmers over time, retaliatory aggression detonates on contact. The trigger is simple. Someone crosses a line. Your brain interprets the violation as an attack on your status, your safety, or your sense of control. And instead of pausing to assess, it activates the most primitive response available. Strike back now, think later. What makes it dangerous is the speed. There's no deliberation, no cost-benefit analysis. The aggression fires before conscious thought catches up. By the time you realize what you're doing, you've already done it. The insult is out. The punch is thrown. The message is sent. And the damage, once released, doesn't reverse. It shows up everywhere intensity runs high. In arguments that escalate from words to physical confrontation in seconds. In road rage incidents where a honk becomes a chase. In sports where a hard foul turns into a brawl. The pattern is always the same: perceived disrespect, instant reaction, consequences that spiral beyond the original offense. The justification follows immediately. They started it. They disrespected you. You had to defend yourself. And in the moment, that reasoning feels bulletproof. But retaliatory aggression doesn't defend. It escalates. It takes a manageable conflict and turns it into something that can't be walked back. The cruelest part is how automatic it becomes. Once your brain learns that aggression restores control, it defaults to that response faster each time. The threshold lowers. Smaller offenses trigger bigger reactions. Until you're exploding at slights that wouldn't have registered a year ago, wondering why you can't just let things go. Because retaliatory aggression isn't about letting go. It's about proving, in the most immediate way possible, that you won't be pushed. And by the time you realize the cost, you're already standing in the wreckage. Grievance collecting. How many times have they been late? How many times have they forgotten? How many small comments, minor slights, tiny inconsistencies have piled up without ever being addressed? You don't bring it up. Not yet, but you remember. Every instance gets filed away. Every little offense adds to the running tally. And one day, when the moment is right, or when you've finally had enough, the entire list comes out. Not as isolated incidents, but as proof. Proof that they've always been this way. Proof that you were right to feel wronged. This is grievance collecting. The habit of accumulating small offenses over time, building a case against someone without ever giving them a chance to address the individual complaints. Where revenge motivation seeks immediate retaliation and resentment replays a single wound, grievance collecting compiles evidence. It turns minor frustrations into a psychological ledger that grows heavier with each entry. The mechanism works like this. Someone does something that bothers you. It's not big enough to confront directly. Maybe it's not even intentional. But instead of letting it go or addressing it in the moment, you store it. You add it to the list. And every new offense, no matter how small, reinforces the narrative you're building. They don't care, they never change. They'll always be like this. What makes grievance collecting so destructive is that the other person has no idea the list exists. They think things are fine. Meanwhile, you're quietly compiling months or years of unspoken resentment. And when it finally erupts, they're blindsided. Because they're not defending against one thing. They're defending against everything you've been holding on to, all at once. You see it in relationships where one partner brings up arguments from years ago during a current fight. In workplaces where an employee quits and delivers a resignation letter detailing every slight from the past 2 years. In families where decades of unaddressed tension explode during a single holiday dinner, leaving everyone wondering where it all came from. And the justification is always the same. You gave them chances. You waited for them to change. You were patient. But the truth is, you never gave them the chance to fix individual problems. You just kept adding to the list, waiting for the pile to get big enough to justify your anger. Grievance collecting doesn't resolve conflict. It weaponizes it. It turns every small misstep into ammunition for a future confrontation. And by the time the list comes out, the relationship is already beyond repair. Because you're not asking them to fix one thing. You're asking them to answer for everything. All at once. With no warning that the debt was even accumulating. Moral outrage. Someone cuts in line. Someone says something offensive online. Someone gets away with something they shouldn't. And the anger that rises up doesn't feel petty or selfish. It feels righteous. Because this isn't about you. This is about what's right. This is about justice. This is moral outrage. The emotional response to perceived violations of fairness, ethics, or social norms. And unlike other forms of revenge-driven emotion, moral outrage comes with built-in justification. You're not being vindictive. You're standing up for what's right. You're holding people accountable. You're defending principles that matter. Here's how it works. When you witness behavior that violates your sense of fairness, your brain doesn't just register disapproval. It activates the same neural pathways involved in personal threat. The violation feels like an attack, not on you specifically, but on the moral order you believe in. And that triggers a powerful urge to restore balance. To punish the offender. To make sure they don't get away with it. What makes moral outrage so potent is that it bypasses self-interest entirely. You're not defending your own status or safety. You're defending a principle. And that gives the anger a weight and legitimacy that personal grievances don't carry. It's not revenge. It's justice. But here's the trap. Moral outrage feels so righteous that it's almost impossible to question. Once you've framed your anger as a defense of what's right, any attempt to de-escalate feels like compromise. Like letting wrongdoing slide. Like being complicit. So the outrage intensifies. The punishment escalates. And what started as a defense of principles becomes indistinguishable from personal vendetta. You see it in online pile-ons where a single misstep triggers thousands of people to demand someone lose their job, their platform, their livelihood. Not because they were personally harmed, but because the offense violated a shared moral standard. In political movements where opposition isn't just disagreement but moral failing that deserves total destruction. In communities where anyone who breaks an unspoken rule faces immediate expulsion, not as punishment, but as necessary enforcement of values. And the justification is unshakable. They deserved it. They knew the rules. They chose to violate them. The outrage isn't excessive. It's proportional. It's what justice requires. Except the person delivering that justice rarely asks whether the punishment fits the crime. Because once moral outrage takes hold, the crime becomes whatever justifies the punishment you're already committed to. The danger is that moral outrage makes cruelty feel like duty. It turns personal anger into collective action. And it gives you permission to do things you'd never do in the name of self-interest. Because you're not acting for yourself. You're acting for everyone. For the principle. For what's right. But strip away the moral framing, and what's left is still revenge. Directed, focused, and amplified by the belief that this time, the harm you're causing is justified. Betrayal revenge. There's a difference between being wronged and being betrayed. When someone wrongs you, they break an agreement. When someone betrays you, they break trust. And trust, once shattered, doesn't repair. It transforms into something colder, something that demands an answer. Betrayal revenge is what happens when the person who was supposed to protect you becomes the person you need protection from. The friend who shared your secrets. The partner who broke their promises. The colleague who sabotaged your work behind your back. The violation isn't just about what they did. It's about who they were when they did it. The mechanism runs deeper than ordinary revenge. When you're betrayed, your brain doesn't just process harm. It processes deception. The realization that while you were operating under one set of rules, they were operating under another. That gap between what you believed and what was real creates a specific kind of rage. Not hot. Calculated. Personal. And the retaliation matches the violation. Betrayal revenge doesn't want fairness. It wants destruction. You don't just want them to feel what you felt. You want them to lose what you lost. Trust, surety, security, the belief that people are who they say they are. If they took that from you, you'll take it from them. And everyone around them. You see it in divorces where one partner doesn't just leave. They dismantle. They expose affairs, drain accounts, turn children against the other parent. Not out of need, but out of principle. The principle that betrayal deserves total war. In friendships that end with public call-outs, private messages screenshot and shared, reputations systematically destroyed. In workplaces where whistleblowing isn't about justice, but about making sure the person who betrayed you never works again. The justification is always the same. They didn't just hurt you. They lied. They pretended. They made you believe something that wasn't true. And that makes them worse than an enemy. It makes them a fraud. One that deserves to be exposed, dismantled, and left with nothing. What makes betrayal revenge so complete is that it doesn't stop at the person who betrayed you. It extends to anyone who might still trust them. Because if you can't have your innocence back, at least you can make sure they never fool anyone else the way they fooled you. Humiliation revenge. You're standing in front of people, colleagues, friends, strangers, and someone says something, a joke at your expense, A criticism that lands too hard. An exposure of something you wanted hidden. The room laughs. Or worse, goes quiet. And in that moment, you don't just feel embarrassed. You feel small. Reduced, stripped of the dignity you walked in with. That feeling doesn't fade when the room clears. It stays. And it demands correction. Not privately. Publicly. Because public humiliation requires public revenge. Humiliation revenge operates on a simple principle: restore what was taken in front of the same audience that witnessed the loss. When someone humiliates you, they don't just insult you. They redefine you in the eyes of others. They change how people see you. And the only way to undo that is to redefine them. Harder. Lewder. In a way that makes everyone remember. The target isn't just the person who humiliated you. It's your reputation. Your standing. The version of yourself that existed before they spoke. And you can't get that back quietly. You have to reclaim it where it was taken. In front of the same people. With the same intensity. Or greater. You see it in workplaces where someone who was embarrassed in a meeting spends months building a case to publicly discredit their humiliator. In social circles where a single cruel comment triggers a campaign of gossip, rumor, and strategic exclusion designed to destroy the other person's image. In relationships where private pain gets weaponized in public arguments, each side trying to win the sympathy of witnesses. The escalation is always the same. They embarrassed you once. You embarrass them worse. They respond. You respond harder. Until the original offense is buried under layers of counter-offense. And no one remembers who started it. Only who went further. And here's the trap. Humiliation revenge doesn't restore dignity. It just creates more humiliation. Yours, theirs, everyone caught in between. But by the time you realize that, you're too deep in the cycle to stop. Because stopping feels like admitting defeat. And defeat, after public humiliation, feels like erasure. Justice restoration motive. You call it justice. They call it revenge. And the line between the two is thinner than you think. Justice restoration motive is the drive to restore fairness when you believe the system, or the people around you, have failed to deliver it. Someone got away with something. Someone faced no consequences. Someone benefited from harm they caused. And the anger that rises isn't just personal, it's principled. You're not seeking revenge. You're correcting an imbalance. You're making sure the scales tip back where they belong. Here's how it works. When someone wrongs you and faces no official punishment, your brain interprets that as a failure of justice. The world is supposed to be fair. Bad actions are supposed to have bad consequences. When they don't, it creates cognitive dissonance, a mismatch between what you believe should happen and what actually happened. And that mismatch demands resolution. So you step in, not as a vigilante, as a restorer. You're not causing harm. You're delivering the consequence they avoided. You're not being vindictive. You're being fair. And that framing makes everything permissible. Because you're not acting out of anger. You're acting out of principle. The problem is that once you've appointed yourself as the arbiter of fairness, your definition of fair becomes whatever restores your sense of order. If they hurt you and walked away, fair means they hurt worse. If they gained something through wrongdoing, fair means they lose more than they gained. The punishment scales with your anger, not with the offense. But because you've framed it as justice, the escalation feels measured. You see it in online pile-ons where someone's past mistake resurfaces and thousands of strangers decide the appropriate consequence is unemployment, social exile, and permanent public shame. Not because the legal system failed. Because the mob decided the legal system wasn't enough. In personal disputes where one party, convinced they were wronged, takes matters into their own hands, delivering punishments that far exceed what any formal process would allow. And the justification never wavers. They deserved it. The system failed. Someone had to act. That someone was you. You didn't want revenge. You wanted balance. You wanted the world to make sense again. But strip away the moral language, and what you delivered wasn't justice. It was retribution dressed in the vocabulary of fairness. Scorekeeping psychology. Who paid for dinner last time? Who cancelled plans? Who helped who move? Who remembered the birthday? Who didn't? You're not consciously tracking, but somewhere in your mind a ledger is running. Every favor given, every favor received, every gesture made, every gesture ignored. And when the numbers don't balance, when you've given more than you've gotten, the relationship starts to feel less like connection and more like debt. This is scorekeeping psychology, the mental habit of tracking relational exchanges as if they were transactions. Where healthy relationships operate on trust and goodwill, scorekeeping relationships operate on equity. You gave this much. They owe that much. And if they don't pay up, you stop giving. Or worse, you start collecting. The mechanism is subtle. It starts with noticing. You help them move, and they don't offer to help you. You remember their promotion, and they forget yours. Small imbalances. Nothing worth mentioning. But your brain records them anyway. And over time, those imbalances accumulate. Not as isolated incidents, but as evidence of a pattern. Evidence that you care more. That you give more. That the relationship is unequal. What makes scorekeeping so corrosive is that the other person doesn't know the ledger exists. They think everything's fine. Meanwhile, you're quietly calculating every missed gesture, every unreturned favor, every asymmetry in effort. And when the score gets lopsided enough, you stop trying. Not because you don't care. Because the math no longer justifies the investment. You see it in friendships where one person suddenly pulls back, and the other has no idea why. In relationships where affection becomes conditional, given only when equivalent affection is received. In workplaces where collaboration turns transactional, each person carefully measuring their contributions against everyone else's, withholding effort the moment the balance tips unfavorably. And the justification is always the same. You are keeping things fair. You are protecting yourself from being taken advantage of. You are making sure the relationship stayed balanced. But what scorekeeping actually does is kill spontaneity. It turns generosity into leverage. It makes every interaction a calculation. And eventually, the relationship stops being a relationship. It becomes a ledger. One where neither side feels satisfied, because equity, when measured this closely, never feels equal. Delayed revenge. You don't react immediately. You don't lash out. You don't make a scene. You smile. You nod. You let it go. And they think it's over. They think you've moved on. They think they got away with it. They're wrong. Delayed revenge is revenge with patience. Where retaliatory aggression explodes on contact and revenge motivation strikes fast, delayed revenge waits. It watches. It plans. It lets time pass until the target has forgotten the offense entirely. And then it strikes. Calmly. Precisely. With a level of calculation that immediate anger could never produce. The psychology is straightforward. Immediate revenge is messy. It's emotional. It's traceable. You lash out, and everyone knows why. The connection between offense and retaliation is obvious. But delayed revenge severs that connection. Enough time passes that when the retaliation comes, it doesn't look like revenge. It looks like bad luck. A coincidence. An unrelated event that just happens to devastate the person who wronged you. What makes delayed revenge so effective is that it removes the emotional noise. When you wait, the initial rage fades. What's left is clarity. You're not acting on impulse. You're acting on strategy. You know exactly what will hurt them most. You know exactly when they'll be most vulnerable. And you know how to deliver the blow in a way that doesn't point back to you. You see it in workplaces where someone who was passed over for promotion waits months. then quietly undermines the person who got the job, feeding information to competitors, sabotaging key projects, all while maintaining a friendly facade. In relationships where an old betrayal gets answered years later, not with confrontation, but with strategic withdrawal at the moment the betrayer needs support most. In social circles where someone who was excluded engineers a slow campaign of reputation damage, so subtle and spread out over time that no one connects it to the original slight. The target never sees it coming, because by the time the revenge lands, they've forgotten they ever gave you a reason. They're confused. They're blindsided. They can't figure out why this is happening to them. And you never tell them, because the beauty of delayed revenge is that they suffer without understanding. And that ignorance, that inability to connect cause and effect, makes the punishment complete. Displaced aggression. Your boss yells at you. You can't yell back. You need the job. So you swallow it. You stay quiet. You go home. And then your partner asks an innocent question. And you snap. Hard. Way harder than the question deserved. This is displaced aggression. The redirection of anger from a source you can't confront to a target you can. When the person who provokes your rage is untouchable, your brain doesn't let the anger dissolve. It finds an outlet. Someone safer. Someone less powerful. Someone who won't punish you for retaliating. The mechanism is simple. Aggression, once activated, needs release. It's a physiological state. Your heart rate elevates. Your muscles tense. Your body is primed to fight. But if you can't fight the person who triggered the response, the arousal doesn't just disappear. It lingers, waiting for an acceptable target. And the moment someone else gives you even a minor reason, the floodgates open. All the anger meant for your boss, your parent, your institution comes pouring out, directed at someone who had nothing to do with the original offense. What makes displaced aggression so insidious is that it feels justified in the moment. The person you're snapping at did do something. They were late. They forgot something. They asked the wrong question at the wrong time. And in your heightened state, that minor infraction feels massive. You're not overreacting. They deserve your anger. Except they don't. They're just the nearest available outlet for rage that was never theirs to absorb. You see it in homes where a parent, stressed from work, comes home and erupts at their children over trivial mistakes. In relationships where frustration from one area of life bleeds into another, turning small disagreements into explosive fights. In public spaces where someone who's been powerless all day finds one person they can dominate, a customer service worker, a subordinate, a stranger, and unloads disproportionate fury over the smallest inconvenience. The original source of the anger never faces consequences. The boss keeps yelling. The system keeps failing. The untouchable person stays untouchable. But the people around you, the ones who didn't provoke you, who didn't deserve your rage, they absorb it. And you tell yourself it's not your fault. They shouldn't have pushed you. They should have known better. But the truth is simpler. You needed someone to hurt, and they were there. Displaced aggression doesn't solve anything. It just redistributes suffering. The person who caused your pain walks away unscathed. And the people who care about you carry wounds they never earned. Rumination after injury. Why can't you stop thinking about it? You've tried to move on. You've tried to focus on other things. But it keeps coming back. The argument. The insult. The moment they hurt you. And every time it replays, it sharpens. Gets louder. Feels worse than it did the first time. This loop, this mental replay of harm, is called rumination. It's the brain's attempt to process injury by reviewing it. Over and over. Searching for understanding, for closure, for some way to make sense of what happened. But instead of resolving the pain, rumination amplifies it. Each replay reinforces the wound. Each review adds detail, until the memory becomes more vivid, more consuming than the original event. Here's why it happens. When you're hurt, especially in a way that feels unfair or unresolved, your brain treats it as an open file. Something that needs to be understood, categorized, filed away. But if there's no resolution, no apology, no consequence, the file stays open. And your mind keeps pulling it up, trying to find an answer that doesn't exist. The danger is that rumination doesn't stay neutral. It evolves. At first, you're just replaying what happened. But soon, you start adding interpretations. They did it on purpose. They knew it would hurt. They don't care. The thoughts spiral from observation to narrative. And that narrative becomes the truth you carry. It shows up everywhere. The breakup you can't stop analyzing, dissecting every conversation for clues you missed. The argument with a friend that plays on loop, each replay making you angrier about what they said. The professional slight that occupies every quiet moment, turning a single criticism into evidence of a larger pattern of disrespect. And the worst part is that rumination convinces you it's helping. It tells you that, if you just think about it enough, you'll figure it out. You'll understand why they did it. You'll find the response you should have given. You'll restore the justice that was denied. But what actually happens is that the injury never heals. It just deepens. Because every time you replay the wound, you're reopening it. Vengeance fantasy. You're lying in bed, or sitting in traffic, or in the shower, and it starts. The scene plays out in your head. Not what happened, what you wish had happened, what you could still make happen. The perfect response, the devastating comeback, the moment where they realize exactly what they did and exactly how much it cost them. This is vengeance fantasy, the mental rehearsal of revenge that never leaves your imagination. Where real revenge requires action and risk, fantasy revenge is safe, private, consequence-free. You can replay it as many times as you want, adjust the details, make it as brutal or as elegant as you need. And for a moment, it feels satisfying. The mechanism is simple. When you've been harmed and can't retaliate in reality, your brain compensates with simulation. It creates scenarios where you win, where they lose, where the balance of power shifts back in your favor. The fantasy doesn't just imagine revenge. It delivers the emotional payoff as if the revenge actually happened. Your heart rate spikes. Your muscles tense. You feel the rush of restored control, even though nothing has changed in the real world. What makes vengeance fantasy so seductive is that it asks for nothing. You don't have to confront anyone. You don't have to risk anything. You just imagine. And imagination, unlike action, can't be taken away from you. They can ignore you in person, but in your mind, they're forced to listen. They're forced to understand. They're forced to suffer. You see it in the person who spends hours mentally rehearsing the argument they'll never have, crafting the email they'll never send, planning the exposure they'll never execute. The fantasy grows more elaborate over time, more detailed, more satisfying, until the imagined revenge becomes a substitute for the real thing, a way to feel like justice has been served without ever serving it. But here's the trap. Vengeance fantasy doesn't resolve anything. It just keeps the wound fresh. Every time you replay the scenario, you're reinforcing the injury. You're teaching your brain that this harm still matters, that it still demands a response. And the longer you stay in the fantasy, the harder it becomes to let go. Because letting go means admitting that the revenge you've been rehearsing will never happen. That the satisfaction you've been imagining will never be real. Moral licensing for revenge. You've been the bigger person. You've turned the other cheek. You've forgiven when you didn't have to, compromised when you shouldn't have, given second chances that were never earned. And now, after all that goodness, after all that restraint, you've earned the right to hit back. Just this once. Just for this. This is moral licensing for revenge. The psychological trick where past good behavior becomes permission for present bad behavior. You're not being cruel. You're balancing the scales. You've been kind enough, patient enough, forgiving enough. And that accumulated virtue gives you credit. Credit you can now spend on retaliation. Here's how it works. When you've acted morally in the past, your brain stores that behavior as proof of your character. You're a good person. You've demonstrated it. And once that identity is established, it creates psychological slack. Room to deviate. Because one bad action doesn't erase all the good ones. It just evens things out. You're not becoming a bad person. You're just cashing in on the goodness you've already banked. The justification is airtight. You gave them chances. You were patient. You held back when you could have retaliated, but they kept pushing. They didn't appreciate your restraint. They mistook your kindness for weakness. So now the restraint ends. Not because you're vindictive, because you've earned the right to stop being kind. You see it in relationships where one partner tolerates behavior for months, then uses that tolerance as justification for an explosive response. I've put up with this for so long, I'm allowed to lose it now. In workplaces where someone who's always been professional decides that their history of professionalism gives them permission to sabotage a colleague without guilt. In friendships where years of being the understanding one become the reason it's okay to cut someone off without explanation. And the pattern is always the same. The more good behavior you've accumulated, the bigger the revenge you feel entitled to. You didn't just forgive once. You forgave repeatedly. So the retaliation doesn't have to be proportional to the last offense. It has to account for all of them. Every slight you ignored, every insult you swallowed, every boundary you let slide. The ledger is full. And now it's time to collect. What makes moral licensing so dangerous is that it turns virtue into currency. Being kind isn't an end in itself. It's an investment. One that eventually pays dividends in the form of guilt-free cruelty. You don't feel bad about the revenge. You feel justified. Because you've already proven you're not a bad person. This one act of retaliation doesn't change that. It just balances the equation. Payback urge. Not every injury demands strategy. Some just demand a response. Fast, direct, equivalent. They hit you, you hit back. They insult you, you insult harder. They take from you, you take more. The calculation is simple. What they did, you do. Only worse. This is the payback urge. The instinct to return harm in kind, immediately and without complication. Where revenge motivation builds a case and resentment simmers quietly, the payback urge is transactional. A debt created. A debt repaid. The goal isn't transformation or justice. It's balance. They caused pain. You cause pain. The scales tip back. Here's the mechanism. When someone wrongs you, your brain doesn't just register the harm. It registers the imbalance. They gained something. Status, control, satisfaction. And you lost something. Dignity, security, peace. That asymmetry creates pressure. An immediate need to restore equilibrium, not through understanding or forgiveness. Through equivalent retaliation. What makes the payback urge so powerful is its simplicity. There's no moral calculation. No long-term planning. No consideration of consequences. Just action and reaction. Cause and effect. They created the debt. You're collecting it. And the transaction feels fair because it mirrors the original offense. They embarrassed you publicly. You embarrassed them publicly. They broke your trust. You break theirs. The symmetry makes it seem just. You see it everywhere tit-for-tat escalation happens. In arguments where every insult is answered with a sharper one, each person matching and exceeding what came before. In online disputes where every accusation is met with a counter-accusation, both sides convinced they're simply responding in kind. In neighborhoods where one act of petness, a blocked driveway, a loud party, triggers an endless chain of equivalent retaliations, neither side willing to absorb a loss without answering it. The problem is that payback never feels equivalent to the person receiving it. What you see as fair retaliation, they see as escalation. Because you're accounting for the harm you felt, and they're only seeing the harm you're causing. So they hit back, harder, harder, and you respond, harder still, until the original offense is buried under layers of reprisal, and no one remembers who started it. Only that the other person deserves what's coming. The payback urge doesn't resolve conflict. It perpetuates it. Because balance, when measured by pain, is impossible to achieve. Every retaliation creates a new debt, and that debt demands payback. And the cycle continues until someone chooses to absorb the imbalance and stop. But stopping feels like losing. And losing after you've already been hurt feels unbearable. Humiliation memory fixation. It was years ago. Maybe a decade. But you remember it like it was yesterday. The room. The faces. The exact words. The feeling when the laughter started. When you realized everyone saw it. Saw you? Exposed. Reduced. Made small in front of people who mattered. Time has passed. Apologies were made. Maybe. People moved on. Probably. But you didn't, because humiliation doesn't fade the way other injuries do. It calcifies. Becomes a fixed point in your internal map. A moment that defines how you see yourself and how you assume others still see you. This is humiliation memory fixation. The inability to let go of a public embarrassment, even when the audience has forgotten. Where most memories soften with time, humiliation memories sharpen. Each replay makes them clearer. More detailed, more painful. Until the memory isn't just something you recall, it's something you relive. The mechanism is rooted in how humiliation differs from other forms of harm. When someone insults you privately, the injury is between you and them. But when someone humiliates you publicly, the injury involves everyone who witnessed it. They didn't just hurt you. They redefined you in the eyes of others. And that redefinition, that shift in how you're seen, feels permanent. Even if the audience forgot the next day, you can't. Because the moment changed you. What makes humiliation memory fixation so corrosive is that it operates on a loop. You remember the humiliation. The memory triggers shame. The shame makes you avoid similar situations. The avoidance reinforces the belief that the humiliation still matters. And the cycle repeats. The memory doesn't just remind you of what happened. It convinces you that it's still happening, that people still remember, that your status never recovered. You see it in the person who avoids entire social circles years after a single embarrassing incident, who can't attend reunions because they're still carrying the shame of something no one else recalls, who structures their life around avoiding repetition of a moment that, to everyone else, was forgettable. The fixation doesn't just preserve the memory. It expands it, turns one moment into a defining characteristic. And the tragedy is that the humiliation becomes self-sustaining. You assume people remember, so you act like someone who's been humiliated, guarded, defensive, hypervigilant. And that behavior, not the original incident, becomes what people actually notice. The memory you're trying to escape becomes the thing that defines you. Not because the humiliation was unforgettable, but because you never let it go. Social exclusion revenge. They didn't invite you. The group chat you weren't added to. The lunch you weren't told about. The event that everyone attended except you. And when you found out, they said it was an accident, an oversight, nothing personal. But it was personal, because exclusion always is. Social exclusion revenge is retaliation for being left out. Not attacked, not insulted. Just forgotten. Made invisible. And the anger that rises from that invisibility is specific. You don't want to hurt them the way they hurt you. You want them to feel what you felt. The isolation. the irrelevance. The realization that you don't matter enough to include. Here's why exclusion cuts so deep. Humans are wired for belonging. Social connection isn't optional. It's survival. And when a group signals that you're not part of it, your brain doesn't register mild disappointment. It registers threat. Rejection activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. The hurt isn't metaphorical. It's real. And it demands a response. The revenge follows the injury. If they excluded you, you exclude them. You form your own group. You host your own events. And you make sure they see it. Make sure they know they weren't invited. The goal isn't just to build something without them. It's to make them feel the sting of being on the outside. To show them that you don't need them. That you're fine without them. Better, even. You see it in friend groups that fracture after one person feels left out, the excluded person immediately forming a tighter circle with others, and making sure the original group sees it. In workplaces where someone who wasn't invited to a key meeting starts holding their own meetings, deliberately leaving out the people who excluded them. In families where one branch stops attending gatherings after feeling slighted, then hosts their own events on the same dates, forcing everyone to choose. The justification is always the same. They started it. They made it clear you weren't wanted. So you're just showing them the same courtesy. You're not being petty. You're protecting yourself, building your own community. One that values you, but underneath the justification is the real goal. Make them regret it. Make them wonder what they're missing. Make them feel, even for a moment, the irrelevance they made you feel. The problem is that social exclusion revenge doesn't restore belonging. It just creates more exclusion. You're not rejoining the group. You're building a rival one. And the division, once created, rarely heals. Because no one wants to be the first to reach out. Reaching out feels like admitting you were hurt. Like admitting you still care. So both sides stay separate. Both convinced the other deserved it. Both still carrying the wound that started the split. Reputational revenge. Watch their career crumble. Watch their friendships dissolve. Watch their name become something people whisper about, avoid, distance themselves from. You didn't touch them. You didn't confront them. You just made sure the right people knew the right things. And now they're untouchable for entirely different reasons. Reputational revenge is the systematic destruction of someone's standing, credibility, or social capital. Where other forms of revenge target the person directly, reputational revenge targets how others see them. The goal isn't to hurt them yourself. It's to make everyone else do it for you. Here's why it works. Reputation is currency. It determines who trusts you, who hires you, who includes you. And unlike physical harm or financial loss, reputational damage spreads. One person hears something. They tell two others. Those two tell four. The story mutates as it travels, gets sharper, gets worse. And by the time it circles back to the target, the damage is done. Not by you. By everyone. The mechanism is elegant. You're not making accusations. You're just raising questions. Just sharing concerns. Just making sure people have the full picture. And because you're framing it as honesty, as transparency, as looking out for others, the destruction feels justified. You're not gossiping. You're warning. You're protecting. You're doing what any responsible person would do. You see it in workplaces where one well-placed rumor, true or exaggerated, ends a career faster than any formal complaint could. In social circles where someone's past mistake gets strategically resurfaced at exactly the moment it will cause maximum damage. In industries where reputation is everything, where whisper campaigns and quiet blacklisting happen behind closed doors, leaving the target confused about why opportunities keep vanishing. The beauty, from the perspective of the person seeking revenge, is deniability. You didn't do anything. You just told the truth. Shared what you knew. Let people draw their own conclusions. If their reputation suffered, that's on them. They're the ones who did whatever you're reporting. You're just the messenger. And here's the cruelest part. Reputational revenge doesn't end when the rumor stops spreading. It lingers. Years later, people still remember the story, even if they forgot the details. The stain never fully washes out. The target moves on, rebuilds, finds new opportunities. But somewhere, someone still remembers. Still hesitates. Still wonders if there was truth to what they heard. The revenge becomes permanent, not because you keep attacking, but because reputation, once damaged, never fully heals. Passive revenge. You could help. You have the information they need, the connection that would solve their problem, the expertise that would save them time. But when they ask, you're suddenly unavailable. Busy. Can't remember. Sorry, wish you'd asked earlier. This is passive revenge. Retaliation through withdrawal. Where active revenge strikes directly, passive revenge withholds. It doesn't attack. It just stops supporting. Stops contributing. Stops being there. And the absence, the sudden lack of help that used to be freely given, becomes the punishment. The psychology is subtle. You're not doing anything wrong. You're not obligated to help. You don't owe them your time, your resources, your effort. So when you stop providing those things, you're just setting boundaries, protecting your energy, taking care of yourself. The fact that your withdrawal happens to devastate them. That's just a coincidence. But it's not a coincidence, and you both know it, because the timing is too perfect. The help dries up exactly when they need it most. The support vanishes right when they're most vulnerable. And the message is clear without ever being stated. You could help. You're choosing not to. And that choice is an answer. You see it everywhere. Relationships turn transactional. The colleague who stops covering shifts after being passed over for promotion. The friend who becomes perpetually unavailable after a fight, never saying they're upset, just always having other plans. The family member who stops showing up to events, not with drama or explanation, just quiet, consistent absence. The target can't even confront it, because what are they going to say? You're not helping me enough. You're not being available. It sounds entitled, demanding, like they're the problem for expecting support that was never owed. So they absorb the loss silently, confused, wondering what changed. Never getting an answer because the revenge never announces itself. And that's the trap. Passive revenge gives you all the satisfaction of retaliation with none of the accountability. You hurt them, but you never have to admit it. You never have to defend it. You just stop and watch what happens when the support they took for granted suddenly isn't there anymore. Cold revenge. No anger. No raised voice. No visible emotion at all. Just a calm assessment of the situation. They wronged you. The debt exists, and now you're going to collect it. Not because you're upset. Because it's logical. Fair. Fair. Necessary. Cold revenge is revenge without heat. Where hot revenge erupts from emotion, cold revenge operates from calculation. The person seeking it isn't driven by rage or hurt. They're driven by principle. The principle that actions have consequences. That debts must be paid. That balance must be restored. And emotion in this equation is just noise. Here's the mechanism. When someone harms you, your brain can process it two ways. Emotionally or analytically. Emotional processing leads to hot revenge, immediate and explosive. Analytical processing leads to cold revenge, delayed and precise. The analytical path doesn't suppress the anger. It just redirects it, turns it into fuel for strategy instead of fuel for outburst. What makes cold revenge so effective is patience. Hot revenge acts fast, often sloppily, leaving evidence and regret. Cold revenge waits. It watches. It gathers information. It identifies vulnerabilities. And when it strikes exactly where it will cause maximum damage with minimum risk. The target doesn't see it coming because there was no warning. No emotional build-up. Just suddenly, devastatingly consequence. You see it in business disputes, where one party quietly dismantles the other's network, not through confrontation but through strategic meetings, careful positioning, and months of groundwork. In divorces that turn into methodical asset stripping, every move calculated, every decision designed to minimize what the other person walks away with. In long-term grudges where someone waits years for the perfect moment to reveal information that destroys what the target has built. The person delivering cold revenge doesn't feel guilty. They feel satisfied. Not emotionally. Intellectually. They solved a problem. They corrected an imbalance. The fact that someone suffered in the process isn't cruelty. It's mathematics. They created the debt. You're just collecting. And here's what makes it chilling. Cold revenge doesn't announce itself. It doesn't gloat. It doesn't need the target to know why this is happening. The satisfaction comes from the outcome, not the recognition. Which means the target might never understand that what's happening to them isn't bad luck or coincidence. It's retaliation. Hot revenge. The insult lands. And before you can think, before you can calculate, before you can consider consequences, you're already moving. Shouting. Throwing. Hitting back. Not because it's smart. Because the anger is too immediate to contain. Hot revenge is revenge in the moment. Unfiltered. Unplanned. Driven entirely by the surge of emotion that floods your system the instant you're wronged. Where cold revenge calculates and waits, hot revenge ignites and explodes. The gap between offense and retaliation is measured in seconds. And by the time rational thought catches up, the damage is already done. The trigger is straightforward. Someone crosses a line. Your brain interprets it as an attack. And instead of routing the response through your prefrontal cortex, the part that evaluates and plans, it goes straight through your amygdala. The emotion center, the fight response. The part that doesn't ask if retaliation is wise. Just if it's possible. What makes hot revenge so dangerous is speed. There's no filter. No pause to consider whether this is proportional, whether it's worth it, whether you'll regret it. The reaction is pure. And often excessive. What started as a verbal insult becomes a physical fight. What began as a minor slight escalates into a relationship-ending confrontation. The response far exceeds the provocation because emotion doesn't measure carefully. You see it in road rage incidents where a honk or a cutoff triggers a chase, a confrontation, sometimes violence. In arguments that go from disagreement to personal attack in seconds, each person matching and exceeding the other's intensity. In bars, parties, public spaces where perceived disrespect leads to immediate physical retaliation, no thought given to who's watching or what happens next. The justification comes after. They started it. They deserved it. You had to defend yourself. But in the moment there was no justification. Just reaction. The offense happened. The anger spiked. The revenge followed automatically. And only later, when the adrenaline fades, do you start constructing reasons why it was necessary. The problem with hot revenge is that it feels right at the time. The release is immediate. The satisfaction is real. But when the heat dissipates and you're left looking at what you did, at the consequences you didn't consider, the satisfaction turns to something else. Not always regret, but often recognition. That the price you just paid for that momentary release might be higher than the original offense was worth. Revenge via withdrawal. They call. You don't answer. They text. You reply hours later, brief and cold. They ask to meet. You're busy. Indefinitely. Not because you're punishing them. You'd never say that. You're just prioritizing yourself. Taking space. Focusing on other things. But they know. And you know they know. Because the timing is too precise. The withdrawal started exactly when they hurt you. And the absence of your presence, your attention, your care, is the loudest message you've never spoken. Revenge via withdrawal is retaliation through removal. Where other forms of revenge add something, harm, conflict, confrontation, withdrawal subtracts. It removes access, removes support, removes you, and that subtraction, that sudden void where connection used to be, becomes the punishment. Here's why it works. Relationships operate on exchange. Attention, time, emotional labor. When one person consistently provides those things, the other person adapts. They come to expect it, rely on it, build their routines around it. And when it suddenly stops, the absence doesn't feel neutral. It feels like loss, like something was taken, even if it was never owed. The mechanism is elegant because it's unfalsifiable. If they confront you, what can they say? You're not doing anything to them. You're just not doing things for them anymore. You haven't attacked. You haven't insulted. You've just stepped back. And stepping back isn't aggression. It's self-care, boundary setting, healthy distance. The fact that it hurts them isn't your fault. It's theirs, for becoming dependent on something you were never obligated to provide. You see it in friendships where one person becomes perpetually unavailable after feeling slighted. Not saying they're hurt, not explaining what changed, just consistently absent. In relationships where affection and intimacy vanish overnight, replaced by politeness and distance, leaving the other person confused and scrambling to fix something they don't understand. In workplaces where collaboration stops, not with confrontation but with professional coldness, help withdrawn, communication reduced to the bare minimum. The power of withdrawal is that it forces the other person to come to you. They have to ask what's wrong. They have to initiate the conversation you refuse to start. And in that dynamic, you've already won. Because you're not chasing, you're not explaining, you're not justifying. You're just gone, and they're the ones left wondering how to get you back. But here's the cost. Withdrawal as revenge requires you to stay withdrawn. If you come back too soon, the message weakens. If you explain too clearly, it stops being withdrawal and becomes confrontation. So you stay distant, stay removed. And sometimes, the distance that started as punishment becomes permanent. Because withdrawal doesn't just punish them, it isolates you too. Vindictiveness. Some people let it go. You don't. Some people forgive. You remember. Some people move on. You wait. Not because this specific offense was unforgivable, because holding grudges is just what you do. It's not a choice. It's who you are. This is vindictiveness. Not a single act of revenge, but a sustained pattern of retaliation. A personality trait as much as a behavior. Where most people's anger fades with time, vindictive people's anger compounds. Every slight adds to the ledger. Every offense reinforces the pattern. And eventually, retaliation isn't something they decide to do. It's something they default to. The psychology runs deeper than individual grievances. Vindictive people don't just react to being wronged, they scan for it. They're hypervigilant for disrespect, betrayal, unfairness. And because they're looking for it, they find it. Often where others wouldn't. A neutral comment becomes an insult. An oversight becomes intentional dismissal. And once the slight is registered, the need for payback becomes automatic. What makes vindictiveness different from ordinary revenge is duration. Normal revenge has a target and an endpoint. You were wronged. You retaliate. The score is settled. Vindictiveness has no endpoint. The score is never settled. Because even after you've gotten revenge for one offense, you're still carrying the others. And new ones keep arriving. The ledger stays open. Permanently. You see it in people who bring up years-old conflicts in current arguments. Who never forget a slight, no matter how minor, and reference it forever. who can't maintain relationships because every disagreement gets added to an ever-growing list of grievances, who structure their entire social and professional lives around avoiding people who wronged them once, years ago, in ways most people wouldn't even remember. The justification is consistent. You're just standing up for yourself, refusing to be a doormat, making sure people know they can't treat you any way they want without consequences. And in isolation, each act of retaliation might seem justified. But the pattern reveals something else. Not self-defense. A worldview where everyone is a potential enemy and every interaction is a potential slight waiting to be avenged. The tragedy of vindictiveness is that it's exhausting. Carrying that many grudges, tracking that many scores, planning that many retaliations. It requires constant vigilance, constant anger, constant calculation. And the people who live this way rarely notice how much energy it consumes. Because to them, it's not optional. It's survival. And letting go, forgiving, moving on, those aren't strengths. They're weaknesses. Invitations to be hurt again. So the cycle continues. The ledger grows. And the vindictive person stays locked in a world where everyone owes them something, and no one ever pays enough. Victim identity fixation. Being wronged once doesn't define you, unless you let it, and some people do. They take the injury, the betrayal, the unfairness, and they make it central. Not just something that happened to them. Something that explains them. Who they are. Why they struggle. Why they can't trust. Why they can't move forward. This is victim identity fixation. The psychological pattern where past harm becomes present identity. Where the role of victim stops being a temporary state and becomes a permanent characteristic. And once that identity locks in, everything else reorganizes around it. Here's the mechanism. When you're harmed, especially deeply, your brain tries to make sense of it. And one way to make sense of suffering is to give it meaning. To let it explain patterns. Why relationships fail. Why opportunities don't work out. Why life feels harder for you than for others. The harm becomes a lens. And eventually, the lens becomes the view. What makes this fixation so powerful is that it's self-reinforcing. If you see yourself as someone who's been wronged, you start interpreting new experiences through that frame. Neutral events become further evidence. Ambiguous interactions become proof. And anything that contradicts the narrative, kindness, opportunity, support, gets dismissed as temporary or insincere. The identity protects itself by rejecting anything that challenges it. You see it in people who introduce themselves through their trauma. Whose bio, whose story, whose explanation for every difficulty starts with what was done to them. In relationships where one person's past hurt becomes the reason present problems can't be addressed, because they've already suffered enough, already been through too much. In professional settings where past injustice becomes the explanation for current underperformance, the justification for why standards shouldn't apply. The danger isn't that the harm wasn't real. Often it was. The danger is that the fixation prevents recovery. Because recovery would mean losing the identity. And if being wronged is who you are, then healing becomes a threat. It means you'd have to be someone else. Someone without the narrative. Someone responsible for their present without the past as a shield. Victim identity fixation doesn't just keep the wound open. It makes the wound load-bearing. Remove it, and the whole structure collapses. So it stays. Not because the person can't heal, because healing would mean rebuilding everything. And that feels impossible. Easier to stay broken. At least broken makes sense. Status injury retaliation. They promoted someone else. Someone less experienced. Someone who hasn't put in the years you have. And when you ask why, the answer is vague. Politics. Timing. Fit. Nothing you can argue with, nothing you can fix. Just the quiet message that you're not as valuable as you thought. That hits differently than ordinary insults. Because status injuries don't just hurt your feelings. They redefine your position. They tell you and everyone watching that you're lower in the hierarchy than you believed. And that gap, between where you thought you stood and where you actually stand, demands correction. Status injury retaliation is revenge aimed at restoring rank. Not just punishing the person who lowered you, but visibly reclaiming the standing you lost. The goal isn't private satisfaction. It's public proof. Proof that you're not as diminished as the injury suggested. Proof that the hierarchy was wrong. Proof that you still matter. The mechanism is rooted in social animals. Humans, like most hierarchical species, are wired to track status. It determines access to resources, respect, influence. And when your status drops, especially publicly, your brain registers it as a survival threat. Not metaphorical. Actual. Because in evolutionary terms, low status meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant danger. So the retaliation targets status. You don't just want the person who demoted you to suffer. You want them to lose standing. You want their decision to backfire. You want everyone who witnessed your fall to see theirs. And you want your own position restored, not through quiet competence, but through visible victory. You see it in workplaces where someone passed over for promotion immediately starts undermining the person who got it, not subtly, but visibly, making sure everyone sees the new hire's mistakes. In social hierarchies where someone excluded from a group retaliates by forming a rival group and poaching members, ensuring the original group's influence shrinks. In families where inheritance disputes become public battles, each side trying to prove they're the favored one, the legitimate heir, the one who deserves more. The retaliation rarely restores what was lost, because status, once publicly questioned, doesn't fully recover through revenge. You might damage the person who hurt you. You might rebuild some influence. But the question, the uncertainty about where you actually belong, that lingers. And sometimes the retaliation itself becomes the proof that you were never as secure as you thought. Because people who are truly confident in their status don't need to fight this hard to prove it. Moral superiority in revenge. You're not sinking to their level. You're holding them accountable. You're not being petty. You're enforcing consequences. You're not seeking revenge. You're restoring justice. And the fact that they suffer in the process, that's not cruelty. That's fairness. This is moral superiority in revenge. The framing that transforms retaliation into righteousness. Where ordinary revenge admits it's personal, moral superiority revenge insists it's principled. You're not acting out of anger or hurt. You're acting out of duty. The duty to make sure wrongdoing doesn't go unanswered. To prove that actions have consequences. To protect others from suffering the same harm you did. Here's how it works. When you frame your revenge as moral enforcement, you bypass guilt. Guilt requires admitting you're doing something wrong. But if you're doing something right, if you're the one defending standards, upholding values, making sure bad behavior gets punished, then there's nothing to feel guilty about. You're not the aggressor. You're the corrective force. What makes this framing so seductive is that it feels true. The person did wrong you. They should face consequences. And if no one else is delivering those consequences, why shouldn't you? The logic is airtight. Which is exactly why it's dangerous. Because once you've convinced yourself that your revenge is justice, there's no limit to what you can justify. Any escalation becomes proportional. Any cruelty becomes necessary. Because you're not hurting them for yourself. You're hurting them for everyone. You see it in cancel culture, where the stated goal isn't revenge but accountability. Making sure the person learns, making sure others are protected, making sure the community is safe. Except the accountability looks indistinguishable from destruction. In divorces where one spouse claims they're just protecting the children while systematically dismantling the other parent's relationship with them. In professional disputes where someone insists they're just ensuring standards are maintained while actively sabotaging a colleague's career. The target of this revenge rarely gets the chance to make amends. Because moral superiority revenge doesn't want rehabilitation. It wants punishment. And punishment justified by morality doesn't have to be proportional, doesn't have to consider context, doesn't have to stop when the harm is balanced. It only has to stop when the punisher feels the moral order has been restored, which, conveniently, tends to align with the point where the target has suffered as much as the punisher wanted them to. Punishment desire. What would be enough? An apology. Restitution. Time served. Or is there something deeper pulling at you? Not just the need to balance the scales, the need to see them hurt, to watch them face consequences, to know that what they did cost them something real, something painful, something they can't undo. This is punishment desire. The drive not just to restore fairness, but to inflict suffering. Where justice seeks balance, punishment seeks pain. And the distinction matters. Because punishment, unlike justice, isn't satisfied by restoration. It's only satisfied by harm. The psychology is primal. When someone wrongs you, your brain doesn't just want the situation fixed. It wants the person who caused the problem to pay. Not metaphorically, literally. And the payment it demands isn't restitution. It's suffering. Theirs. Proportional to yours. Or greater. What makes punishment desire so compelling is that it feels righteous. They hurt you. They should hurt back. That's not revenge. That's balance. That's fairness. Except fairness doesn't require pain. It requires correction. But correction doesn't satisfy punishment desire. Only watching them suffer does. And once you notice that gap between what would fix the problem and what you actually want, the desire reveals itself for what it is. Not justice. Vengeance. You see it everywhere restorative justice fails. In criminal sentencing where victims demand maximum penalties, not because it prevents future harm, but because it makes the offender suffer more. In relationship conflicts where one person refuses reconciliation until the other has endured equivalent pain, even when the relationship itself could be repaired without it. In workplaces where someone who was wronged won't accept any resolution that doesn't include the offender being fired, demoted, publicly shamed. The justification is always proportionality. They hurt you this much. They should suffer that much. But punishment desire doesn't actually measure proportionality. It measures satisfaction. And satisfaction, when it comes to revenge, is a moving target. The more you get, the more you want. The suffering you thought would be enough never quite is. Because punishment desire doesn't close wounds. It just keeps demanding more. Eye for an eye thinking. They took from you. So you take from them. They hurt you. So you hurt them back. They broke the rules. So you break them too. The equation is simple. What they did, you do. The response mirrors the offense. And that symmetry, that perfect balance, feels like justice. This is eye for an eye thinking, the belief that fairness means equivalent retaliation, that the right response to harm is identical harm. Not more. Not less. Exactly the same. And on the surface, it makes sense. If someone takes your eye, taking theirs restores the balance. You're not escalating. You're equalizing. You're making things fair. But here's the problem. Eye for an eye thinking assumes both sides measure harm the same way. They don't. What feels equivalent to you feels excessive to them. Because you're measuring the harm you felt. And they're measuring the harm you're causing. The asymmetry is built in, which means every act of equivalent retaliation gets perceived as escalation. And every escalation demands a response. Bigger, harsher, until the original offense is buried under cycles of supposedly equivalent revenge. You see it in feuds that span generations. Family disputes where the original slight, a perceived insult, an unfair inheritance split, triggers retaliation that triggers counter-retaliation that triggers more, each side convinced they're just responding in kind. In international conflicts where tit-for-tat strikes continue for decades, both sides claiming self-defense, both sides certain the other started it, both sides matching what they see as equivalent force. The trap is that eye for an eye thinking feels restrained. You're not being excessive. You're being fair. You're only doing what was done to you. But fairness measured by pain is impossible to calibrate. Because pain is subjective. What cost you sleep for weeks might barely register to them. What devastated you might seem minor from the outside. So when you match their action with your action, you think you're being proportional. They think you've escalated. And the cycle continues. Eye for an eye thinking doesn't create balance. It creates endless reciprocation. Each side convinced they're the victim. Each side convinced they're just responding appropriately. Each side waiting for the other to stop first. And no one stops. Because stopping feels like losing, like letting them get away with it, like absorbing more harm than you gave. So the equation continues, eye for eye, until everyone's blind. Revenge justification. You're not wrong for wanting revenge. They wronged you first. You're not overreacting. Anyone in your position would feel the same. You're not being vindictive. You're just making sure there are consequences. Every step of the way, you have a reason. A good one. One that makes sense. One that, if you explained it to someone else, they'd understand. Maybe even agree. This is revenge justification. The mental process of framing retaliation as reasonable, necessary, or deserved. It's not a single thought. It's a running narrative. One that starts the moment you're hurt and continues through every stage of planning, executing, and reflecting on revenge. And the narrative's goal is simple. To make sure you never have to admit that what you're doing is wrong. Here's how it works. The moment you decide to retaliate, your brain starts building the case. Not for others. For you, it collects evidence. They did this. They deserve that. It draws comparisons. What you're planning is less than what they did. It invokes principles. Actions have consequences. People need to learn. It predicts outcomes. If you don't respond, they'll do it again. Or worse. And here's the key. None of these justifications are necessarily false. They might have wronged you. They might deserve consequences. You might be preventing future harm. But truth and justification aren't the same thing. Truth is what happened. Justification is the story you tell yourself about what happened. And that story has a purpose. To let you do what you want to do without feeling like the bad guy. You see it in every revenge scenario. The person planning retaliation doesn't see themselves as cruel. They see themselves as fair. They don't see themselves as vengeful. They see themselves as principled. They don't see themselves as stooping to the other person's level. They see themselves as restoring balance. The justification doesn't change the action. It just changes how the action feels. And the more elaborate the justification, the more extreme the revenge tends to be. Because small acts of retaliation don't require much explanation. But big ones, destructive ones, disproportionate ones, those need scaffolding. Layer after layer of reasons why this is okay. Why this is necessary. Why this is somehow the right thing to do. The tragedy of revenge justification is that it works. It lets you retaliate without guilt, without doubt, without hesitation. You're not doing something wrong. You're correcting something wrong. And by the time the dust settles, by the time you see the damage you've caused, the justification is so embedded that even then, you don't question it. You just add one more layer. They made you do this. They left you no choice. And the story continues, protecting you from the truth, that you wanted revenge. And everything else was just the reason you gave yourself to take it. Third-party revenge support. You weren't there when it happened. You didn't see it. You didn't experience it. but your friend did. And when they tell you the story, when they describe what was done to them, something rises in you. Not sympathy. Anger. The same anger you'd feel if it happened to you. Maybe stronger. Because you're not clouded by hurt or confusion. You're just clear. Someone wronged them. And that person needs to answer for it. This is third-party revenge support. The psychological drive to retaliate on behalf of someone else. Not because you were harmed. Because someone you care about was. And their injury becomes your cause. Their enemy becomes yours. And the revenge you're willing to pursue sometimes exceeds what they'd pursue themselves. The mechanism is rooted in social bonds. When you're close to someone, their pain activates your protective instincts. But it does something else too. It removes the emotional complexity that might restrain them. They might feel guilty about retaliating, conflicted, uncertain. You don't. You just see the injustice. And you're free to act on it without the weight of personal involvement clouding your judgment. What makes third-party revenge so dangerous is that it escalates without the usual breaks. When you're the one who was hurt, you might hesitate. Worry about making things worse. Question whether it's worth it. But when you're acting for someone else, those hesitations vanish. You're not risking your own relationships. You're not worried about your own reputation. You're just delivering justice. And that freedom makes you capable of things the actual victim might never do. You see it in friend groups where one person's conflict becomes everyone's war. The person who was hurt wants to move on, but their friends won't let it drop, tracking down the offender, spreading rumors, engineering social consequences. In families where one member's grievance becomes a multi-generational feud, children and grandchildren carrying grudges for offenses they never witnessed. In communities where harm to one member triggers collective retaliation far beyond what any individual would have chosen. And here's the twist. Third-party revenge often claims to be protective. You're standing up for them, supporting them, making sure they're not taken advantage of. But sometimes the person you're avenging didn't ask for it, doesn't want it, would rather let it go. But you can't, because the revenge isn't really for them anymore. It's for you. For the anger you felt when you heard their story, for the loyalty you want to demonstrate, for the satisfaction of making someone pay. Their injury was just the excuse. Collective revenge sentiment. One person is wronged, but the anger doesn't stay individual. It spreads through the group, through the community, through everyone who identifies with victim or shares their identity. And suddenly, it's not just one person seeking revenge. It's dozens, hundreds, all unified by the same target, all convinced that what was done to one was done to all. This is collective revenge sentiment. The transformation of individual grievance into group cause. Where personal revenge is bounded by one person's capacity for retaliation, collective revenge has no such limit. It pools anger, coordinates action, and delivers consequences far beyond what any single person could achieve. Here's why it happens. Humans are tribal. When someone in your group is attacked, your brain doesn't process it as their problem. It processes it as a threat to the group, and threats to the group demand group response. The injury becomes shared, the enemy becomes communal, and the retaliation, when it comes, carries the weight of collective anger. What makes collective revenge so powerful is scale. One person can be ignored, avoided, isolated, but a group can't. A group can surround, can pressure, can make continued existence in that space unbearable. The target isn't just dealing with one angry person. They're dealing with a unified force. And that force doesn't need to be fair or measured. It just needs to be unified. You see it everywhere identity and grievance intersect. In online movements where one person's complaint becomes a mass campaign, thousands of strangers joining the pile on, each adding their voice to the collective demand for punishment. In political movements where historical wrongs against a group become justification for present retaliation against individuals who'd nothing to do with the original harm. In workplaces where one employee's mistreatment triggers mass walkouts, boycotts, public shaming campaigns that extend far beyond the original incident. The justification is always solidarity. We're protecting our own. We're standing together. We're making sure this doesn't happen again. But collective revenge doesn't prevent future harm. It just distributes present harm more efficiently. And the person on the receiving end often isn't the one who caused the original injury. They're just the available target. The person unlucky enough to represent, in the group's eyes, the category of offender that needs to be punished. Honor revenge. They didn't just insult you. They insulted your family, your name, the legacy you carry. And in cultures where honor matters more than happiness, where reputation is survival, that insult isn't just personal. It's existential. It questions whether you're worthy of the respect your lineage demands, whether you're strong enough to defend what's yours, whether you deserve to carry the name at all. Honor revenge is retaliation driven not by personal hurt, but by social standing. The goal isn't to feel better. It's to prove you're not weak. That disrespect has consequences. That your family, your name, your honor cannot be violated without answer. And in contexts where honor is everything, the failure to retaliate isn't forgiveness. It's humiliation, permanent, public, unacceptable. The psychology operates differently than ordinary revenge. When someone harms you personally, you can choose to let it go. Move on. Forgive. But when the harm targets your honor, the choice isn't yours alone. Because honor isn't individual, it's inherited, shared, observed. And if you don't defend it, you're not just accepting the insult. You're validating it. You're telling everyone watching that the disrespect was deserved. That you are, in fact, as weak as the insult suggested. What makes honor revenge so rigid is that it follows rules. Not personal preference. Cultural codes. If someone disrespects your family, the response is prescribed. If someone violates your sister, your daughter, your wife, the retaliation isn't optional. It's required. And the community watches, judges, remembers. Your status, your family's future, your children's prospects, all hinge on whether you respond appropriately. Which means proportionally. Which means often violently. You see it in cultures where family feuds span generations, each act of revenge triggering counter-revenge, each side bound by honor to continue the cycle, even when both want it to stop. In communities where a daughter's perceived immorality becomes justification for violence, not out of personal anger but out of obligation to restore family honor. In conflicts where insults to national pride demand military response, not because the insult caused material harm, but because failing to respond signals weakness. And here's the cruelest part. Honor revenge traps everyone. The person seeking it doesn't want to. They'd rather let it go, but they can't. Because honor isn't about what you want. It's about what the community expects. And if you fail to deliver, you don't just lose respect. You lose your place, your identity. Everything that makes you who you are in that context. So you retaliate, not because you chose revenge, because honor demanded it. Envy-based retaliation. They have what you want. The job, the relationship, the success, the recognition. And when they get it, you don't just feel disappointed. You feel wronged, because in your mind you deserved it. You worked for it. You were qualified. And the fact that they got it instead doesn't feel like competition. It feels like theft, like something was taken from you. And theft demands retaliation. This is envy-based retaliation. Revenge driven not by harm done to you, but by good fortune granted to someone else. The target didn't attack you. They just succeeded where you didn't. But in the logic of envy, their gain is your loss. Their victory is your defeat. And that asymmetry, that gap between where they are and where you are, becomes unbearable. The only way to close it is to pull them down. Here's the mechanism. Envy operates on comparison. You measure yourself against others. And when someone near you, someone you see as similar, someone you believe you're equal to or better than, surpasses you, it creates cognitive dissonance. The world isn't supposed to work this way. They're not supposed to be ahead. You are. And when reality contradicts that belief, your brain doesn't adjust the belief. It reframes reality. They didn't earn it. They got lucky. They cheated. They took what should have been yours. What makes envy-based retaliation so insidious is that it disguises itself. You don't admit you're envious. You frame it as justice, as exposing fraud, as making sure standards are upheld. You're not tearing them down out of jealousy. You're correcting an error, revealing the truth, making sure they don't get away with something they didn't deserve. You see it in workplaces where someone's promotion triggers a campaign to undermine them. Not because they're incompetent, because the person who didn't get promoted can't stand watching them succeed. In social circles where someone's new relationship, new achievement, new happiness becomes the target of gossip, sabotage, strategic exclusion. In creative fields where another artist's recognition triggers efforts to discredit their work, question their originality, diminish their accomplishment. The retaliation rarely admits its source. It's framed as principle, as honesty, as holding people accountable. But the energy behind it, the focus, the persistence, that comes from envy. From the unbearable feeling of watching someone else have what you wanted. And the retaliation doesn't aim to get what they have. It aims to make sure they lose it. Because if you can't have it, at least you can make sure they don't enjoy it either. Narrative retelling of injury. You've told the story before, many times. To friends, to family, to anyone who'll listen. And each time you tell it, it gets a little sharper, a little clearer. The details that support your version stick, the ones that complicate it fade. And over time, the story stops being a memory. It becomes a script, one you've rehearsed so thoroughly that you can't remember what actually happened anymore. Only what you've been saying happened. This is narrative retelling of injury, the process of repeatedly recounting harm until the retelling replaces the original event. And here's what makes it dangerous for revenge. Each retelling doesn't just preserve the memory. It intensifies it. The injury feels worse. The offender seems more malicious. Your own innocence becomes more absolute. And with each repetition, the case for revenge becomes stronger. Not because new evidence emerged, because the story evolved. The mechanism is psychological rehearsal. When you tell the story, you're not just reporting facts. You're organizing them, emphasizing some details, downplaying others, interpreting ambiguities in ways that support your emotional truth. And each time you tell it, those choices calcify. What started as your interpretation becomes your memory. And your memory becomes the only version you can access. What makes narrative retelling so powerful is that it's social. You're not just convincing yourself. You're convincing others. And when they validate your version, when they agree that you were wronged, that the other person is terrible, that revenge would be justified, they're not just supporting you. They're locking in the narrative, making it harder to revise, harder to question, harder to let go. You see it everywhere conflict becomes story. The divorce where each person has their version, incompatible with the others, both certain they're telling the truth. The workplace dispute where the same event gets described two completely different ways, neither side lying, both sides shaped by repeated retelling. The family rift where the origin story, told and retold at holidays, becomes gospel, even though the people who were there remember it differently. And here's the trap. Narrative retelling doesn't just justify revenge. It makes forgiveness impossible. Because forgiveness requires seeing the other person's perspective, considering their intentions, acknowledging complexity. But you can't do that when the story you've told yourself is so polished, so complete, so validated by repetition, that any deviation feels like betrayal. Not of the truth, of the narrative. The one you've invested in. The one you've built your identity around. The one that, at this point, you need more than you need resolution. Mistrust after harm. They apologized. They explained. They promised it won't happen again. And maybe they mean it. Maybe they don't. But here's what you know for certain. They did it once. Which means they're capable of doing it again. And that knowledge, that awareness of their capacity for harm, doesn't leave. It sits there, quiet, waiting, turning every interaction into a potential repeat. This is mistrust after harm. The enduring suspicion that follows betrayal or injury. Where most emotions fade with time, mistrust compounds. Because trust, once broken, doesn't repair. It transforms into vigilance, into doubt, into the constant low-grade belief that the person who hurt you is still a threat, still capable, still possibly planning. Here's why it persists. Trust operates on prediction. You trust someone when you believe you can predict their behavior, that they'll act in ways that align with their commitments, that they won't harm you. But when someone violates that prediction, when they do harm you, your predictive model breaks. And your brain, faced with uncertainty, defaults to caution. It assumes the worst. Because assuming the best already failed once, and it's not willing to fail again. What makes mistrust so corrosive is that it's unfalsifiable. If they act trustworthy, you suspect they're hiding something. If they're transparent, you wonder what they're not showing you. If they keep their promises, you wait for the moment they break them. Every interaction gets filtered through suspicion. And suspicion, once established, finds evidence everywhere. Not because the evidence is there, because you're looking for it. You see it in relationships where one betrayal poisons everything that follows. The partner who cheated years ago, forgiven but never trusted. Every late night at work becoming potential proof of relapse. In friendships where one lie, even a small one, makes every future statement questionable. In professional settings where one unethical act makes every subsequent decision suspect. Colleagues watching, waiting for the person to reveal their true nature again. And here's what connects mistrust to revenge. Mistrust doesn't just make you defensive. It makes you preemptive. If you believe they're going to hurt you again, why wait? Why give them the chance? Better to strike first. Protect yourself. Make sure that if betrayal is coming, you're the one who controls when and how it lands. Mistrust doesn't lead to revenge directly, but it creates the conditions where revenge feels like self-defense, where retaliation becomes protection, where hurting them first is just common sense. Hypervigilance for betrayal. Every late reply feels suspicious. Every change in tone signals something hidden. Every unexplained absence becomes potential evidence. You're not paranoid. You're just paying attention. Because you've been blindsided before. And you're not letting it happen again. This is hypervigilance for betrayal. The heightened state of alertness that follows being deceived or hurt. Where most people give others the benefit of the doubt, you scan for threats. For inconsistencies. For signs that trust is being violated again. And because you're looking, you find them. Everywhere. The mechanism is protective. Your brain learned that people can deceive you. That trust can be weaponized. That what looks safe might not be. So it compensates. It raises the threshold for trust and lowers the threshold for suspicion. Every interaction gets filtered through a simple question: could this be betrayal? And when the answer is even possibly yes, the alarm sounds. What makes hypervigilance so exhausting is that it never rests. You can't turn it off. You can't decide to stop scanning. Because the moment you relax, The moment you let your guard down, that's when you're vulnerable. That's when they could strike. So you stay alert. Always watching. Always analyzing. Always one step away from concluding that the worst is happening again. You see it in relationships where one betrayal turns every interaction into an investigation. The partner who checks phones, questions schedules, demands explanations for minor deviations from routine. Not because they want to control, because they can't stop looking for proof that they're being lied to again. In friendships where one broken confidence makes every conversation feel calculated, every shared secret a potential weapon. In workplaces where one colleague's backstabbing turns every meeting into a search for hidden agendas, every casual conversation into potential intelligence gathering. And here's where it connects to revenge. Hypervigilance doesn't just make you defensive. It makes you preemptive. If you believe betrayal is coming, if you're certain you've detected the signs, why wait to be the victim? Better to act first. To retaliate before they complete whatever you're sure they're planning. The revenge isn't responding to actual harm. It's responding to anticipated harm. To the betrayal you're convinced is already in motion, even if it exists only in your vigilance. Boundary retaliation. You asked them to stop, clearly. Directly, they didn't listen. Or they pretended not to hear. Or they agreed and then did it again. The boundary you set, the line you drew, they crossed it anyway. And now the violation isn't just annoying, it's insulting. Because they didn't just ignore your request. They ignored you. Boundary retaliation is revenge for having your limits dismissed. Not for being attacked. For being disrespected in a specific way. For stating what you need, what you're willing to tolerate. What crosses the line, and having that statement treated as optional. As negotiable. As something they can ignore without consequence. Here's why boundary violations feel different from ordinary offenses. When someone harms you accidentally, it's a mistake. When they harm you after you've told them not to, it's a choice. They heard you. They understood. And they decided your boundary didn't matter. That their desire to keep doing what they're doing outweighs your right to set limits. And that dismissal, that erasure of your autonomy, triggers something deeper than ordinary anger. The retaliation targets the dismissal. You don't just want them to stop. You want them to understand that ignoring you has consequences. That your boundaries aren't suggestions. That violating them costs something. And the revenge, when it comes, is often disproportionate to the original offense. Because you're not just punishing what they did. You're punishing the fact that they thought they could do it without repercussion. You see it in personal relationships, where someone who's been asked repeatedly to change a behavior finally snaps, not at the behavior itself, but at the pattern of being ignored. The partner who's asked for help around the house, been promised it, and watched nothing change, then refuses to do their own share in retaliation. The friend who's set a boundary about borrowing money, had it crossed repeatedly, and cuts off the friendship entirely. In professional settings where someone whose working hours or responsibilities have been violated retaliates by withdrawing cooperation, declining requests, making the other person's job harder. The justification is always the same. You gave them chances. You communicated clearly. You were reasonable. But they kept crossing the line. So now the line moves. Or disappears entirely. And the retaliation you deliver isn't cruelty. It's enforcement. Making sure they learn, finally, that your boundaries aren't optional. That violating them means losing access. To your help, your kindness, your presence. Whatever they took for granted when they decided your limits didn't apply to them. Shame to anger shift. You felt small, humiliated, exposed in a way that made you want to disappear. The shame sat in your chest, heavy and paralyzing. And for a moment, you turned it inward, blamed yourself, questioned whether you deserved it. But then something shifted. The shame didn't dissolve. it transformed into anger, hot, directed outward, at the person who made you feel that way. This is the shame to anger shift, the psychological conversion of internal humiliation into external aggression, where shame makes you want to hide, anger makes you want to attack. And when the two emotions collide, when shame becomes unbearable, anger offers an escape. A way to stop feeling powerless and start feeling powerful, by making someone else suffer. The mechanism is defensive. Shame signals that you've been diminished, that your social value has dropped, that you're vulnerable to judgment, rejection, exclusion. And your brain, faced with that threat, has two options: accept the diminishment, or reject it by attacking the source. Anger chooses rejection. It says the problem isn't you. It's them. They wronged you. They'll pay for it. And in that reframing, the shame lifts. Not because the situation changed, because you stopped absorbing it and started projecting it. What makes the shame to anger shift so dangerous is speed. One moment, you're crushed. The next, you're furious. And the fury doesn't feel like a defense mechanism. It feels like clarity, like you've finally seen the situation for what it is. An injustice, one that demands correction. The shame that was paralyzing you moments ago now fuels you, drives you toward retaliation, not as revenge, as restoration, of the dignity they took, of the power they tried to strip. You see it everywhere. Public humiliation triggers violence. The person mocked in front of a group who responds with sudden, disproportionate aggression. The employee criticized in a meeting who shifts from embarrassment to rage, lashing out at the critic with accusations, insults, threats. The partner exposed in an argument who pivots from defensive shame to offensive attack, bringing up past grievances, flinging insults, escalating far beyond the original conflict. And the retaliation, when driven by converted shame, tends to overshoot. Because you're not just responding to what they did. You're responding to how they made you feel. And the feeling, humiliation, doesn't have a proportional response. It just demands that they feel worse than you do, that the shame you carried gets transferred to them, that they're the ones left diminished, exposed, small. The way you were before anger saved you from drowning in it. Status equalization through revenge. They're above you, in the hierarchy, in the org chart, in the social ladder, and they use that position, make decisions that affect you without asking, give orders you're expected to follow, enjoy privileges you don't have access to, and for a while you accept it, because that's how hierarchies work, until one day you don't. Because the gap, that distance between where they are and where you are, stops feeling like structure and starts feeling like injustice. Status equalization through revenge is retaliation aimed at closing rank gaps. Not by rising to their level, by pulling them down to yours. The goal isn't to gain power. It's to strip theirs, to make sure that whatever authority they hold, whatever advantage they enjoy, costs them something. So that even if the hierarchy doesn't change, at least they're not comfortable at the top anymore. Here's the psychology. Hierarchies create resentment. Not always. Not universally. But when the person above you seems undeserving, when their position feels unearned, when the benefits they receive look disproportionate to their contributions, the imbalance grates. And your brain, wired to detect unfairness, starts calculating. Not how to climb. How to correct. How to make sure that if you can't have what they have, at least they can't enjoy it without consequence. The retaliation takes specific forms. Undermining their authority. Publicly questioning their decisions. Spreading doubt about their competence. Not to replace them, just to weaken them. To make their position less secure. To introduce friction into what was smooth. Because if they're struggling, if they're defending themselves, if their status is under threat, then the gap between you narrows. Not because you rose, because they fell. You see it in workplaces where subordinates sabotage managers they resent, not by refusing orders, but by executing them incompletely, slowly, in ways that create problems the manager has to solve. In social hierarchies where people lower in status spread gossip about those higher up, chipping away at their reputation until their position feels less secure. In families where children or younger members retaliate against parental authority, not through direct defiance but through passive resistance, making every interaction harder, every request a negotiation. The justification is always fairness. They don't deserve to be that far above you. They're not that much better. They just got lucky. Or political. Or they knew the right people. So leveling the field isn't revenge. It's correction. Making sure the hierarchy reflects actual worth. And if that means they suffer, well, maybe they should have thought about that before acting like the position made them untouchable. Secret retaliation. They'll never know it was you. They'll never connect the dots. They'll think it was bad luck, a coincidence, an unrelated mishap. But you'll know. You'll know that the thing that just went wrong for them, the opportunity that vanished, the information that leaked, the support that evaporated, that was you. Quietly, carefully, leaving no trace. Secret retaliation is revenge delivered in stealth. Where public revenge announces itself, demands recognition, wants the target to know exactly why they're suffering, secret revenge operates in shadow. The satisfaction doesn't come from them knowing you hurt them. It comes from you knowing. And them never finding out. The appeal is simple. Plausible deniability. You're not the aggressor. You're just a bystander. If confronted, you can deny everything. And because you left no evidence, no witnesses, no clear connection between their harm to you and your harm to them, the denial holds. You stay clean. They stay confused. And you get the satisfaction of revenge without the risk of accountability. What makes secret retaliation so effective is that it doesn't trigger counter-revenge. Because they don't know who to retaliate against. They know something went wrong. They suspect sabotage. But without a clear target, their anger diffuses. Becomes frustration. Becomes paranoia. They might suspect everyone, but they can't prove anything. And suspecting everyone is the same as suspecting no one. It doesn't lead to action. Just corrosion of trust. You see it in professional settings where someone quietly ensures a competitor doesn't get key information, doesn't get invited to critical meetings, doesn't get credit for work they contributed to. The sabotage is subtle, a conversation that happens without them. An email chain they're left off. A decision made before they have a chance to weigh in. In personal relationships where someone retaliates by withdrawing support at a critical moment, claiming they forgot they were busy, they didn't realize it mattered. In social circles where exclusion happens strategically but always with a cover story, always with an excuse that sounds reasonable enough that calling it out makes you look paranoid. And here's the psychology. Secret retaliation removes guilt. Because you're not openly cruel. You're not visibly aggressive. You're just quietly not helping. Quietly letting things fall through. Quietly ensuring that the person who wronged you doesn't benefit from your presence, your resources, your goodwill. And if that absence causes them to fail, well, that's not your fault. You weren't obligated to save them. You just chose not to. Silently. And that choice, invisible to everyone but you, delivers all the satisfaction of revenge with none of the social cost. Public revenge signaling. You don't just want them to suffer. You want everyone to see it. The retaliation isn't private. It's performed, witnessed, documented, shared, because the point isn't just punishment. It's demonstration. Proof delivered publicly that you're not someone who tolerates being wronged. That crossing you has visible consequences. That everyone watching should take note. This is public revenge signaling. Retaliation designed not just to harm the target but to communicate to the audience. The message isn't only for the person who wronged you. It's for everyone else. a warning, a claim, a statement about who you are and what happens to people who hurt you. The psychology operates on reputation. In social systems, how others perceive you determines how they treat you. If you're seen as someone who absorbs harm quietly, you become a safe target. People will test your boundaries, take advantage, assume you won't push back. But if you're seen as someone who retaliates, visibly and forcefully, the calculation changes. The cost of wronging you goes up, and potential offenders think twice. So public revenge isn't just about settling the current score. It's about preventing future ones. By making an example, by showing, in a way everyone can see, that you're not weak, not passive, not someone who lets things slide. You're someone who answers harm with harm, publicly, without hesitation. And that display, that performance of retaliation becomes your armor. Protection through demonstrated willingness to strike back. You see it everywhere reputation matters. In online spaces where someone publicly calls out, shames, or mobilizes against a person who wronged them, the goal is much about signaling to the community as punishing the individual. In professional environments where someone's firing, demotion, or humiliation is made visible, ensuring everyone knows what happens when you cross certain people. In social circles where conflicts become spectacles, each side performing their grievance and their retaliation for an audience whose opinion will shape future interactions. The escalation is built in. Because private revenge doesn't signal, only public revenge does. So the retaliation has to be visible, has to be dramatic enough that people notice, has to be clear enough that the connection between offense and punishment is obvious. And that requirement pushes the revenge beyond what might be proportional in private. Because in public, it's not enough to hurt them. You have to be seen hurting them. The performance matters as much as the act. And here's the trap. Public revenge locks you in. Once you've signaled that you retaliate, you can't stop. Because if someone wrongs you and you don't respond publicly, the signal weakens. People start wondering if you've gone soft, if the reputation was all talk. So you have to keep performing, keep demonstrating, keep making examples. Not because each individual offense demands it, because the audience expects it. And the moment you stop delivering, the protection the signal provided vanishes. Self-destructive revenge. Hurting them means hurting yourself. You know this? The revenge you're planning will cost you money, relationships, opportunities, maybe more than it will cost them. But you're doing it anyway, not despite the cost, because of it. Because the willingness to suffer proves something. That your anger is real, that the offense was unforgivable, that you'd rather burn everything down than let them walk away unscathed. This is self-destructive revenge. Retaliation that harms the avenger as much as, or more than, the target. Where rational revenge weighs costs and benefits, self-destructive revenge embraces the cost, wears it as proof of commitment, of how deeply they wronged you, of how far you're willing to go to make sure they pay. The psychology defies logic deliberately. Normal revenge seeks to restore balance while minimizing personal damage. Self-destructive revenge rejects that calculation. It says the point isn't to come out ahead. The point is to make sure they don't. And if you have to lose to ensure they lose worse, that's acceptable. The mutual destruction becomes the message. You mattered enough that I was willing to destroy myself to destroy you. What makes this pattern so dangerous is that it operates outside deterrence. Most revenge can be prevented by raising the cost. Make retaliation too expensive and rational actors back down. But self-destructive revenge doesn't respond to cost. It seeks it. The higher the price, the more meaningful the revenge becomes. Because paying a high price proves this wasn't petty. This was serious. Worth sacrificing for. You see it in divorces that drain both parties financially. Neither willing to settle because settling would mean the other person didn't suffer enough, even though continued litigation means both suffer more. In workplace disputes where someone quits or gets fired while ensuring their departure creates maximum chaos for the person who wrongs them, burning bridges they might have needed later. In feuds where retaliation escalates until both sides have lost more than the original offense was worth, but stopping would feel like surrender. And the justification bypasses self-interest entirely. You're not being reckless. You're being principled. Standing up for yourself. Refusing to be pushed around. The fact that it costs you doesn't make it wrong. It makes it noble, a sacrifice for dignity, for justice, for making sure that people who hurt you learn there are consequences, even if those consequences consume you in the process. Obsessive revenge loop. You think about it constantly. First thing when you wake up, last thing before sleep. During work, during meals, during conversations that have nothing to do with it. The revenge. How you'll do it. When. What you'll say. How they'll react. The scenario plays on repeat, evolving, getting more detailed, consuming more of your mental space until there's barely room for anything else. This is the obsessive revenge loop, the psychological state where planning or fantasizing about retaliation becomes compulsive, where revenge stops being a decision you're making and starts being a thought pattern you can't escape. The loop feeds itself. You think about the revenge. The thinking intensifies the anger. The anger demands more revenge planning. And the cycle tightens until you're trapped inside it. Here's the mechanism. Revenge fantasies provide relief. When you imagine delivering consequences, when you rehearse the confrontation, when you visualize their suffering, your brain releases the same satisfaction chemicals as if you'd actually done it. So you get a hit of relief without taking any action. Which sounds good. Until you realize the relief is temporary, it fades. And when it does, the only way to get it back is to replay the fantasy. Again and again, until the replay becomes automatic. What makes the loop obsessive is that it replaces action. At first, you're planning revenge because you intend to do it. But as the loop tightens, as the fantasy becomes more elaborate and more frequent, the planning becomes the revenge. You're not preparing anymore. You're substituting. The mental rehearsal delivers enough satisfaction that actually executing becomes less urgent. But never quite unnecessary. So you stay in the loop. Always planning, never doing, never moving on. You see it in people who've been wronged years ago and still talk about it constantly, still describe in detail what they're going to do about it, still refining their retaliation plan even though they've had countless opportunities to act and haven't. In workplaces where someone nurses a grudge for months, everyone around them hearing about the revenge they're planning, the brilliant way they're going to get back at their target, except the revenge never comes. Just more planning, more elaboration, more obsession. The trap is that the loop feels productive. You're not letting it go. You're not forgetting. You're staying focused on the injustice, preparing for the moment you'll finally act. Except that moment keeps receding. Because the loop doesn't lead to action. It replaces it. And by the time you realize you've been circling for months or years without moving forward, the obsession is so embedded that breaking it feels like letting them win. So you keep circling, planning revenge you'll never take, thinking about justice you'll never deliver, trapped in a loop that promises resolution but only provides repetition. Grudge maintenance. Most anger fades. Not yours. You tend it. Feed it. Keep it fresh. Years pass and the injury that sparked it becomes harder to remember clearly, but the grudge stays sharp. Because you've worked to maintain it. Reminded yourself regularly why they're not forgiven. Why they don't deserve forgiveness. Why the offense, even if others have forgotten it, still matters. This is grudge maintenance. The active preservation of resentment over time. Where normal anger dissipates without fuel, maintained grudges get fueled intentionally. Through rehearsal, through retelling, through deliberately avoiding anything that might soften the anger or complicate the narrative. The grudge becomes something you cultivate, something you're invested in keeping alive. The psychology operates like memory preservation. Memories fade when they're not accessed. But when you regularly revisit a memory, tell the story, reinforce the emotions attached to it, the memory stays vivid. Grudge maintenance works the same way. You keep the offense fresh by replaying it, by framing new interactions through it, by interpreting the person's current behavior as evidence that they're still the person who wronged you, still deserving of the grudge you carry. What makes maintenance active rather than passive is choice. You could let it fade, could focus on other things, could allow time and distance to soften the anger, but you don't, because the grudge serves a purpose. It protects you, reminds you not to trust, justifies your distance, validates your decision to cut them off or limit contact. Letting go of the grudge would mean reconsidering those decisions. And you're not willing to do that. So you maintain it. You see it in families where decades-old conflicts stay alive through retelling. The story of who did what and who's still at fault passed down, kept current, never allowed to become history. In friendships that ended years ago where one person still brings up the betrayal, still describes it in detail, still carries the anger as if it happened yesterday. In professional grudges where someone left a company or was passed over for promotion, and years later still talks about it, still frames their career narrative around that injustice, still carries resentment toward people who've likely forgotten the incident entirely. The justification is memory. You're not holding on to anger. You're just remembering what happened, refusing to let history get rewritten, making sure you don't forget who people really are. But remembering and maintaining aren't the same. Remembering is passive. Maintenance is active. It's choosing to keep the wound open, choosing to feed the anger, choosing to preserve the grudge when you could, if you wanted, let it go. But you don't want to, because somewhere along the way, the grudge became part of who you are. And releasing it would mean losing a piece of your identity. Forgiveness resistance. They apologized, sincerely even. They acknowledged what they did, took responsibility, offered to make amends. Everything you're supposed to want when someone wrongs you. And you said you accepted, but you didn't. Not really. Because saying the words and meaning them are different things. And deep down, you're not ready to forgive. Maybe you never will be. This is forgiveness resistance. The inability or unwillingness to let go of anger even when the conditions for forgiveness are met. Where some people forgive easily, moving past offenses once they're acknowledged, forgiveness-resistant people hold on. Not because the apology was insufficient. Because forgiveness itself feels wrong, like betrayal. Like letting them off too easily. Here's why it happens. Forgiveness requires letting go of the right to punish. And for some offenses, for some people, that right feels too important to release. Because holding on to it means holding on to power. The power to make them keep proving themselves. Keep apologizing. Keep trying to earn back what they lost. Forgiveness would end that dynamic, would restore them to equal standing. And you're not ready to give that up. What makes resistance different from simple unforgiveness is awareness. You know you should forgive. You know they've met the criteria. You know holding on is hurting you as much as them. But knowing doesn't change the feeling. The feeling that forgiving would be wrong, that they haven't suffered enough, that enough time hasn't passed, that you'd be validating what they did by moving on too quickly. So you resist. Not loudly, just quietly, internally, keeping the grudge alive even as you claim to have moved past it. You see it in relationships where one partner says they've forgiven an infidelity but brings it up in every argument, uses it as leverage, never fully allows the other person to move past it. In families where a past offense gets forgiven verbally but remains present in every interaction, the person who was wronged still treating the offender differently, still maintaining distance, still punishing subtly. In friendships where forgiveness is declared but trust is never restored, the relationship continuing but fundamentally changed, the wronged party never quite letting the other person back to where they were before. The cost is relationship stagnation. Forgiveness resistance keeps you in a holding pattern. You can't fully reconnect because you haven't forgiven, but you can't fully separate because you've claimed to forgive. So you stay stuck, halfway between restoration and rupture. The other person confused about where they stand. You confused about what you actually want. Both of you locked in a dynamic where the original offense stays alive indefinitely. Not because it can't be resolved, because you won't let it be. Retaliation under moral cover. You're not being cruel. You're enforcing standards. You're not seeking revenge. You're holding people accountable. You're not attacking. You're defending values. Every move you make, every punishment you deliver, comes wrapped in principle, justified by ethics. Framed as necessary correction, the retaliation disappears behind the moral framework. And from the outside, maybe even to yourself, it looks like justice. Retaliation under moral cover is revenge disguised as righteousness. Where naked revenge admits its personal nature, morally covered revenge claims to be impersonal. About protecting the community, upholding standards, making sure wrongdoing doesn't go unanswered. The moral language isn't decoration, it's camouflage. For anger that's entirely personal but presents as principled. Here's how it operates. You were wronged. That's personal, but instead of saying, "They hurt me and I want them to hurt back," you say, "They violated a rule and must face consequences." The reframe shifts the focus from your pain to their transgression, from your desire for revenge to the community's need for accountability. And once that shift is made, anything becomes justifiable. Because you're not acting for yourself. You're acting for everyone. What makes moral cover so effective is that it's partly true. They probably did violate a standard. They probably should face consequences. The community probably does benefit from accountability. But the energy behind your enforcement, the persistence, the severity, that's not coming from principle. It's coming from anger. Personal anger. That you've successfully externalized as moral duty. You see it everywhere cancel culture operates. Someone who was personally offended doesn't say, "This person hurt me." They say, "This person is dangerous to the community." And then they mobilize that community to deliver punishment far exceeding what any individual retaliation could achieve. In workplaces where someone uses HR complaints, performance reviews, or ethical violations to destroy a colleague who wrongs them, framing personal vendetta as professional standards enforcement. In families where moral or religious codes get weaponized, one member using shared values to punish another, claiming they're protecting family integrity when they're really settling scores. The danger is that moral cover makes cruelty invisible. To others, sometimes to yourself. You can do things under the banner of accountability that you'd never do if you admitted they were revenge. You can escalate without limit because you're not escalating personal conflict. You're enforcing necessary consequences. And anyone who objects, anyone who suggests you're going too far, gets reframed as complicit, as defending wrongdoing, as part of the problem. The moral cover doesn't just hide revenge. It immunizes it from criticism and makes it unlimited. Revenge disappointment. You finally did it. Got them back. Delivered the consequences you'd been planning. And for a moment, maybe it felt good, satisfying, like justice was served. But then the feeling faded, faster than you expected. And what's left isn't closure, it's emptiness. The revenge you thought would fix everything fixed nothing. The satisfaction you imagined would last doesn't. And you're standing in the aftermath, wondering why it feels so hollow. This is revenge disappointment. The emotional letdown that follows successful retaliation, where the fantasy promised resolution, catharsis, restoration, the reality delivers temporary satisfaction, followed by persistent emptiness. Because revenge, it turns out, doesn't actually heal the wound. It just creates a new one, sometimes in them, always in you. Here's why it happens. Revenge operates on a promise. The promise that once you even the score, once you make them hurt the way they hurt you, the pain will stop. The injustice will be corrected. Balance will be restored. But pain doesn't work that way. Their suffering doesn't erase yours. Their loss doesn't restore what you lost. And the act of revenge, instead of closing the chapter, just extends it. Now you're not just the person who was wronged. You're the person who retaliated, and that identity brings its own weight. What makes the disappointment so disorienting is the gap between expectation and reality. You spent so long imagining this moment, planning it, believing it would change things. And when it doesn't, when the revenge lands and you still feel hurt, still feel angry, still feel like something's unresolved, you're left without a script. The thing you thought would fix you didn't. And now you don't know what does. You see it in people who spend years pursuing revenge only to achieve it and realize it changed nothing about how they feel. The ex who ruins their former partner's new relationship and feels empty instead of vindicated. The employee who gets their boss fired and discovers the satisfaction lasted hours, not years. The friend who successfully excludes someone from the group and realizes the victory doesn't heal the original betrayal. And here's the cruelest part. Revenge disappointment often leads to more revenge. Because if this retaliation didn't work, maybe you didn't go far enough. Maybe you need to do more. Hurt them worse. Make the consequences bigger. So instead of recognizing that revenge itself is the problem, you conclude you just haven't done enough of it. And the cycle continues. The disappointment fueling new revenge. The new revenge delivering new disappointment. Until you've spent so much time and energy retaliating that walking away feels impossible. Not because revenge is working. Because admitting it never did would mean accepting that all of it, every act, every sacrifice, every burned bridge was for nothing.